You can definitely be high functioning and still have anxiety. In fact, in my psychotherapy practice for 20 years, most of my anxious clients were very high functioning. Now, high-functioning anxiety is not in and of itself a diagnosis, but you can definitely have a diagnosis of anxiety and still be high-functioning. This has become a very popular term on social media, but there's a fair amount of misinformation out there. And today I'm going to talk about what it is and what you can do about it, how you can help yourself feel better. But one of the main things I want to communicate to you is that if you have a lot of anxiety, don't stop yourself from getting help just because you're high functioning. So, not to state the obvious here, but what is high functioning anxiety? It means you have anxiety and yet you're high functioning. The confusion online about what high functioning anxiety is seems to rest largely on some language which is in the DSM-5-TR, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that is how people get diagnosed. It's the guidelines for diagnosis. And for almost every mental health disorder, there's a line in the qualifications that says that the symptoms that are bothering the person must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So people are interpreting this to mean that you have to have an impact in your functioning, which is not what the DSM says at all. It says if the symptoms cause clinically significant distress, you can have this disorder. It doesn't have to impact your functioning. Now, what does clinically significant distress mean, right? So it is a relative term. It can be interpreted in many ways. There's no very specific guidance as to whether or not it's clinically significant. But if a client of mine wasn't sleeping because of their anxiety, that's clinically significant. And maybe they could have insomnia and still function perfectly fine, but it's not healthy. It doesn't feel good, right? If they're worrying so much, they can't be present with their loved ones. So basically, if their worry and anxiety was causing them enough pain, that's clinically significant. So I want to encourage you, if you feel that you have anxiety, you can take it seriously and you can get help for it. A lot of videos about high-functioning anxiety also say that it's always hidden. Well, some of it is hidden, and maybe it's hidden in some situations. Maybe nobody at work knows how anxious you are, but when you go home, your spouse or your loved ones know how anxious you are. Or maybe you hide it from everybody. But again, whether it's hidden or not, it's not the main thing to be focused on. I'd say that one of the biggest risks with high-functioning anxiety is that the person who is anxious and high-functioning can minimize their own problems. They can minimize their worry and concern because they're like, well, it keeps me productive, or I'm doing fine, but maybe they're not really doing fine. So it can cause you to be dismissive against your own pain. Let me know in the comments if that makes sense to you. Another risk here is that I met a lot of people who would say, I don't have anxiety, I'm not anxious, but when you delve into it, they're very anxious. So there is an element that if you've lived with anxiety your whole life and your parents were anxious, your relatives, basically for generations, everybody's anxious, it may just seem normal to you. Isn't everybody this anxious? So the other risk is not even really recognizing it as a potential problem. So I want to go through very quickly who can this term apply to in a little more depth than simply people with anxiety and people high functioning. But I have seen this apply to people with OCD. Some people with OCD can be very, very high functioning. I have actually seen very high functioning individuals who have panic attacks. So yes, the panic attacks generally impact their functioning in a particular situation, but they're somehow able to get through it, get over it, or hide it from the functioning in the rest of their lives. Social anxiety very often creates impairment in functioning, but not always. Some people with social anxiety, again, this is where that hidden piece comes in. They can hide it. So they're feeling it. Nobody else knows, and they seem fine. And then probably the biggest group of people to whom this term applies are people who have generalized anxiety disorder. And I do go through that in a little bit more depth in a video that I will link here. I'd say the main thing is simply treat it as anxiety. And it doesn't matter, again, whether you qualify for the diagnosis or not. Psychotherapy is still reimbursable if someone doesn't qualify for a full anxiety disorder. There are other diagnoses that can be put down that qualify somebody for insurance reimbursement, which basically indicate, person having a very tough time right now in life, right? Lots of stressors. So you don't have to qualify, but you also don't need to know whether you qualify or not to get the help. And anxiety is treatable. You can get better. So number one, treat it as anxiety, right? Seek out help, professional help, if possible. Look at other videos on general anxiety topics. Practice the same things that anybody who has anxiety could practice. And I have a ton of anxiety videos. I can link a couple at the end of this one, but educate yourself on what it is and how to deal with it. I'd say number three is validate your own feelings. Like, validate the fact that you are worrying too much and you're in pain. And then number four, I'd like to say, have hope. Have hope that this can change. Now, number five, a lot of people with high functioning anxiety will say, I need my anxiety to function. My anxiety is what makes me successful. So they're very attached to the anxiety, even if it's causing them pain, because the success is very important to them, their family, their values, all sorts of things. But you actually can begin to have worry and forward thinking with it being productive, not being the kind of unproductive worry that keeps you awake at night or makes you ruminate. So there is a way to keep your motivation, keep your ability to anticipate problems, but not have it turn into full-blown anxiety. And so lastly, I want to highlight this issue on self-care because a lot of the videos you watch on this topic will tell you get enough sleep, practice self-care. And yeah, you know that, but your anxiety doesn't let you do it, right? It's just not that easy. It can be very hard for people who consider themselves very successful, very high functioning. It can be really hard to make the time for that self-care. It can be really hard to say no to something, to not take on too much. And yes, this is a question of having boundaries, but the answer to being able to have those boundaries is not simply like, here's the steps, say no, do this, do that. The answer is really doing deeper work, looking into what is the negative core belief about yourself that really drives you to need to perform so well that you might be damaging your health and your happiness. It's probably something you learned very early about your role, and being able to set those kind of boundaries for yourself and with other people requires a degree of insight, self-insight, healing of those negative beliefs, and emotional regulation, right? Regulating emotions so you don't get so anxious if you do actually say no to something or stop working on a project or ask for help, right? These are all things that can make people so anxious they don't do them. So that's the kind of work that people do in my program on boundaries. It's way beyond sort of like the information, the list of things you should do that most of us have heard already and still don't do. It's really about the inner work needed to fully understand yourself and your values and your value. Your value as a human being doesn't mean you have to be a human doing. All right, so I'll put the boundary information here on the screen and a link to it in the description. If this applies to you, you might be very interested in that program. A lot of people found it super helpful. So let me know if you have or you think you might have high-functioning anxiety. Was this helpful? Was it not? Did I miss something? If you liked this video, please do hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and let me know what you think. And I'll see you next week.